Good morning, everybody. So we return today to our 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. Today we are up to Gate 68. So our gate statement for today says, mindfulness as a part of the state of truth is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it is wisdom that accords with real Dharmas. So we are wrapping up a section now of this 108 Gates text that's describing the 37 constituent factors of Bodhi, or awakening. We've been working on this section for a while. We've looked at the 4 foundations of mindfulness. We've looked at the 4 exertions, or the 4 restraints. We've looked at the 4 bases of spiritual power, the 5 faculties that lead to liberation, and now we are on to the 7 branches of the balanced truth. That's one way that gets translated. We'll see that there are others. So these are the last of the 37 factors. All right, we've made it through all 37 factors of Bodhi, or at least we will have by the time we get through this last bit. So this gate today is about mindfulness. Once again, we've spent plenty of time on mindfulness itself in no fewer than 11 previous gates. So we don't need to dwell today too much on what mindfulness is. We've done plenty of investigation about that. So the kanji for mindfulness in this particular gate statement come from some original Sanskrit terms that mean 2 things. One is remembering the various states that we pass through in our sitting practice. Remember that, of course, early Buddhist practice was more linear than our Soto Zen practices today, right? So it was very much about you move from one state to another, you move through certain steps on your way to fully awakening. So remembering the various states that we pass through in our sitting practice or in our practice is one meaning, one aspect of this mindfulness. The other meaning is keeping proper awareness in meditation. So again, these feel very early Buddhist, right? And it makes a lot of sense. These are terms that are coming from the earliest part of our practice. In a Soto Zen context, as we've talked about here, mindfulness is simply remembering to practice, right? It's remembering what Buddha taught. It's remembering to see the way Buddha sees. So we remember to see with the eyes of Buddha rather than getting caught up in greed, anger, ignorance, 3 poisons, lots of delusions and obstructions and like that. So I think the more interesting topic for today is what this has to do with wisdom that accords with real dharmas. I think that's the interesting piece to talk about today. We spent plenty of time on mindfulness, but how is mindfulness that is wisdom that accords with real dharmas? That's a kind of an interesting intersection. So there is a wisdom associated with mindfulness in early teachings that understands the true nature of nama and rupa, or name and form. So the wisdom associated with mindfulness understands what namarupa is about. So sometimes we put these 2 terms together into a compound, namarupa. Sometimes we consider each one separately, nama or name and rupa form. So we encounter this kind of both ways in the teachings. The wisdom that sees both the sameness and the difference, the sameness of nama and rupa and the difference between nama and rupa is said to lead to awakening. So this is where mindfulness, wisdom, namarupa all kind of come together, right? This is the intersection for today. So if we understand how name and form are the same, and also how name and form are different, and I'm going to argue how we go beyond even that distinction, then that's awakening in our world, in our practice. That's awakening. So what is this namarupa, name and form? Sometimes namarupa refers to the 5 skandhas: form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness, right? So sometimes namarupa is about this sort of physical form, this sort of human form. The first one, form, is material, and the other 4, of course, are mental. So form is form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness are mental. So this is a mind and body, right? Kind of all together before we start to make some distinctions. So sometimes that's what namarupa refers to if you're reading around in the teachings. Sometimes namarupa means the object of our senses. So the senses of this body come into contact with something, and some name arises, some form arises when senses make contact with something. So there's an object of our perception. We give that thing a name. We distinguish it as having a particular form. Namarupa is there, right? That's how namarupa arises. It's based on our experience of contacting encountering something. So because of our karmic conditioning, our physical senses come in contact with something, then immediately we label it. We call it something, right? We distinguish it from other objects. That distinction, of course, is often based on what does this thing mean for me? Is it good or bad for me? Is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral for me? Is it useful, meaningful, valuable for me? And then, of course, we're off to the races, right? Writing stories, drawing pictures, creating some kind of narrative about whatever this thing is we're encountering, and suddenly something has arisen out of a very simple, sense contact with some object. So, Uchiyama Roshi says, the activities of our daily lives are almost entirely the result of chasing after ideas this way, causing vivid lifelike images to become fixed in our minds, and then giving more and more weight to these fixed illusions and desires until finally we get carried away by them. So there's his description, a very succinct description, right, of how Namarupa arises. So, of course, this is a familiar process for us. We talk about this all the time. This is not new territory. We hear about this from our teachers, from the Buddha, from the sutras. So we're familiar with this process, and here it is again, right? So Uchiyama Roshi then goes on to say, in the Shobogenzo's Mimonki, Dogen has the expression tori tonde tori ni tari. The flying bird resembles a bird. That is, there is no real substance to all of the things to which we attach names. That which has no form, the flying bird, here and now takes a temporary form of a bird, resembles a bird. Dogen's expression is his way of phrasing Nagarjuna's seeing the arising of various dharmas, or various things, destroys the view that nothing exists substantially. Seeing the decay of various dharmas destroys the view that things exist substantially. For this reason, although all the dharmas appear to exist, they are like phantoms or like dreams. So the flying bird resembles a bird means we perceive something. I perceive something, or maybe we hear it. We call it a flying bird. We give it a name. But that's just our name for this bit of form and emptiness that we encounter. There's nothing about that object which is intrinsically a flying bird. We see it, we distinguish it, we name it, label it. Oh, for us, that's a flying bird. There is nothing about that piece of form and emptiness which is intrinsically flying bird. That's all on us, right? Which is interesting when we think about how we create that. So again, Nagarjuna's argument is that seeing the arising of various dharmas proves that things have substance, right? Things arise, we go, oh, there's something there. It has a substance. Seeing that various dharmas perish proves that nothing has substance. Oh, there was something there, now it's gone. So nothing actually exists permanently, substantially. There's nothing I can really grab there. Therefore, although things appear to exist permanently, we recognize that's an illusion. That's our own sort of story that we're writing about whatever it is that we encounter. We give it a name, we distinguish a form, we think it's there forever, or we see that it is impermanent and we think it doesn't exist at all. So we get caught up in, right, our perceptions and what we're making out of those perceptions. Dogen's way of talking about this is the phrase, the flying bird resembles a bird, right? So this thing, which we provisionally call a flying bird, it looks like a flying bird, but there's nothing inherent about that, which is flying bird. That's all something we've created. So Hojo-san has taught more than once about a section of the Sutta Nipata in which the Buddha says that contact between senses and sense objects and the way we give rise to this name and form, Namarupa, is the primary cause of arguments and quarrels, tears and anguish, arrogance and pride, and grudges and insult. So if we're looking around at the conflict in our lives, he says it goes all the way back to our initial sense contact with something. As soon as our senses contact something and we start writing stories, right there are the seeds of conflict and anguish and tears and and lots of human problems. So then Buddha says that if either subject or object is missing from that equation, then contact can't happen. And that whole process of anguish, suffering arising, kind of gets short-circuited, right? You need a subject and an object for that process to kick off. So if one of those elements is missing from that equation, then nothing can happen, right? So Hojo-san says, on hearing this, some people fled society to live in caves, forests, or mountains. This was one way to try to avoid contact. A second way is to try not to think anything and to live without perceptions, concepts, or value judgments. These ways don't work very well. Priests or monks who live in forests or monasteries and try to avoid contact with society don't work to teach and help others. Benefiting others is one of the points of Mahayana Buddhism. Yet when we meet people, situations, and conditions, naturally something happens in our minds. We cannot stop thoughts and emotions from welling up. How then can we avoid this problem of contact? This is the essence of our practice in the teaching of Mahayana. So this gate is pointing us towards something which is really core, right, in our tradition, really core in our teaching. So sometimes we just do things kind of out of our habituated thinking, or maybe without really thinking about what we're doing at all. I eat this cake because it's in front of me and it looks good. Or, I impulse buy yet another bottle of nail polish or something, right? We're kind of on autopilot. Maybe we're not really thinking carefully about what we're doing and the consequences of what we're doing. So it can be an interesting and kind of useful practice for us to inquire into our relationships with these things that we encounter, with objects that we encounter. When we do that, this is how they stop becoming namarupa, right? In other words, how we avoid contact and how we avoid everything that arises from contact. It's not that we're not experiencing those objects, it's that we are not writing stories and creating pictures and, sort of creating that interesting relationship. So, we can ask ourselves, am I buying this or eating this or wearing this or something because it's an object of my desire? Is the point of my relationship with this thing that I'm getting, this small me, is getting something out of it, right? Is what's going to happen as a result of my interaction with whatever this thing is wholesome or not? When I have contact and build this relationship, is what's happening there something which is useful, meaningful, healthy, or not? Am I, being led by desire, led by delusion, or by the mindfulness as wisdom that accords with real dharmas, as this gate statement says? So, what's my motivation, right? What's the outcome I'm looking for out of this relationship? Is it something, which benefits me or me only, or me to the exclusion of others or to the harm of others? What's actually going on there? So rather than moving through the day, moving through the world, not being mindful of how we're engaging and how we're interacting, we can pay a little bit of attention to that. And we can actually learn some interesting stuff by simply paying some attention to our relationships. And I'm saying objects here, but of course objects is everything. Objects is, people and our ideas and, whatever has some name and form out there, right? So our practice is not to be fooled, if you will, by namarupa, right? What does it mean to be fooled by namarupa? So, to think that there is actually a thing that corresponds to the name that we give it. If I call this thing a book, and I think, well, inherently there's something here that's bookness, right? I get fooled by namarupa. If instead I understand, well, I'm calling this thing a book, it has a particular function for me. I hope something wholesome is coming out of the fact that I'm, giving a talk from this book. But, there is nothing about this object which, there's nothing in its essence that means it's a book, it has a particular function, it has a particular use for me, or that I have a particular relationship with it, right? So not to be fooled by namarupa is to use the concepts, use our brains, use our intellects, use our thinking to do the work we need to do in the world, right? To be the bodhisattvas we need to be, to carry out our responsibilities, to do our work, to study the world, to go about our lives, carry out the things we need to do, but at the same time to realize non-separation between self and object, or self and thought, or self and other, or whatever, right? So again, if we're mindful of non-separation, if we don't forget about non-separation, we don't get fooled by namarupa. We don't get sucked into thinking, well, this is, my story about this is the only real thing. So we don't need to destroy namarupa. We don't need to negate it or suppress it or, pretend somehow that it's not okay. This is what humans do. We have sense contact, namarupa arises. So these teachings are not about negating that process or somehow saying, well, that process is itself bad or unwholesome, right? We don't need to ignore it. We don't need to pretend that Namarupa are not there. We just need to be mindful of Namarupa and to see it clearly for what it is. So rather than fighting against it, can we instead investigate it, see it clearly? That's how we become free from Namarupa. So to be free from something doesn't mean something doesn't arise. It doesn't mean we run away from it, right? Being free from Namarupa doesn't mean we cut off arising of Namarupa. It doesn't mean we run away from it, go live in a cave, somehow not have contact with the things of this world. It means we don't get stuck in Namarupa. It means we don't cling to it. We don't take action based on it, create some karma around it, right? If we're seeing clearly, then we can make some good choices. So Hojo-san says, when we clearly see Namarupa as Namarupa, we are released from the bondage between perception and Namarupa. So we're not sort of held in thrall, right? We're not stuck only in the world of seeing Namarupa. We see that, but we also see beyond it. We see what else is happening, right? So in Zazen, for instance, Namarupa ceases to exist in an interesting way. We're just sitting there, we're letting go of thoughts are arising, we're not grasping, we're not clinging, we're not writing stories, they're coming and going. Things just are what they are. We're not adding anything into the mix, and we stop naming and evaluating because things just are what they are. So we're not naming, we're not evaluating, we're not trying to do something with whatever is arising, to grab it, to cling to it, to run away from it, to change it into something we like better, right? So it's not that whatever is arising ceases to exist. It's not that whatever we're encountering isn't actually there. It is certainly still there. The reality is that object is there, but it ceases to be Namarupa because it ceases to be the object of my thought. There's no me and thought which is separate. And as soon as I recognize that non-separation, then whatever is coming up or whatever I'm aware of or experiencing ceases to be Namarupa. It's just the thing as it is. So it reveals itself, in thusness, the emptiness of it reveals itself. It's impermanent, it's interdependent, it has no fixed self-nature, right? We get to see things and understand them for what they really are. In other words, wisdom that accords with real dharmas, right? So at the beginning of the Genjo Koan, Dogen says, when all dharmas are Buddha dharma, there is delusion and realization, practice, life and death, Buddhas and living beings. Now that's a fairly famous sentence. You may have come across that if you've done some work on the Genjo Koan. When all dharmas are Buddha dharma is the same thing as when things stop being Namarupa, when things stop being the object of our thoughts and there stops being a subject and an object and a me and a story, right? So when all things are Buddha dharma is the same thing as we stop sort of creating this Namarupa, or things with which we have a personal relationship that we want to get something out of that connection. I want to feel better about something, or I want to own something, or whatever that means for us. So when things are as they are, then Dogen goes on, there is delusion and realization, practice, life and death, Buddhas and living beings. So we see these things with the eyes of Buddha. We see these things with prajna, with wisdom, with clarity. We see their emptiness, or their suchness, or their thusness, which doesn't mean we don't also see their form, right? Seeing their emptiness doesn't mean we don't also see form. It means we see the whole picture, right? We see the whole thing. So we see with the eyes of Buddha. Well, that's all well and good, we can say, but, we get up off the cushion, we go into the world, and of course there are distinct objects with names and forms, and these things need our attention. The car needs gas, the dog needs to be walked, the dishes need to be washed, the Dharma needs to be studied. Somehow we're back in the world of Namarupa because there are things. We can't ignore our responsibilities, or we can't ignore that, things help us to do the things that we want to do. Objects help us to do the things we want to do. So yes, in Zazen, Namarupa ceases to exist, but we can't avoid Namarupa all the time. So how does mindfulness work as wisdom that accords with all dharmas, or sees the reality of Namarupa, when we have these kind of changing activities and changing situations in our lives? Well, as students of Dogen, or students of the Mahayana, we stop creating separation between ourselves and Namarupa. So we don't negate one or the other, we don't ignore one or the other, but we stop creating the separation. So Namarupa are still part of our lives. We still, if we're going to drink tea, it better be in a cup, right? I mean, we need to interact with things. That still happens. but we recognize that there's no separation here. There is already oneness here, right? It's not something we need to acquire. It's something we need to see and understand. So again, one way to avoid contact with Namarupa is to sit zazen and to drop off the naming, the judging, the labeling, the story writing, whatever's coming up. And another way to avoid contact is to be out in the world 100% interconnected with the objects that we're encountering. So maybe you've heard Hojo-san call this becoming one piece. He says something happens, we become one piece. In other words, we drop separation, or we see non-separation. So on the one hand, we can sit in zazen and not have contact with Namarupa because we're not creating that. And on the other hand, when we're out in the world, we avoid contact by 100% interconnectedness, seeing 100% interconnectedness. So if there's no separation, there's no contact that can happen. Does that make sense? It's okay. That's something we sit with, right? So this is how we can still use tools and eat food and read books and type on a computer and interact with things to do our bodhisattva work in the world. So these things are not objects of our desire. Yes, I need a cup to hold liquid, but this cup is not an object of my desire. Therefore, I'm not creating Namarupa in that particular way. So we can use them, we can take care of them without attachment. We can watch for attachment arising and see what's going on there. So they cease to be Namarupa, but they don't cease to exist. So they can still completely fulfill their functions. They can completely hold their Dharma positions in complete suchness, emptiness, right? So when we see with karmic consciousness, then we're the subject and there's an object out there and we're giving it name and form and Namarupa is happening. When we see with the eyes of Buddha, when we see with the wisdom that accords with all dharmas, then there is only five skandhas seeing five skandhas. So there's no separation again of subject and object, right? So the difference between how we see with karmic conditioning in this limited human form and how we see with the eyes of Buddha. On the one hand, we're creating Namarupa, on the other hand, there's no contact. And yet, these are not separate. So, interestingly, one way to read the kanjis for accords with the real dharmas, the way it is written in this gate statement, has to do with adhering to monastic regulations or protocols or forms, right? In other words, if we're clear about Namarupa, if we understand what they are and how they arise, and what they aren't, and how we work with them, then naturally we carry out forms, like zendo forms, like practice forms, right? So that's an interesting sort of wrinkle on this gate, because we kind of think, well, how do those things go together? That might kind of sound a little weird. It's like, how does understanding Namarupa inevitably lead me to, gasho and bow to my cushion? Or to put down my zagu and do 3 bows. It's like, how does one lead to the other? Because, aren't those things just sort of artificial customs that we've inherited from some kind of Eastern culture? What do they have to do with awakening? Well, so you might know Iko Narasaki Roshi. He was the abbot of Zuioji and Shogoji in Japan. He was one of Zuiko Redding's teachers. She's the head teacher at Cedar Rapids Zen Center. So you might have, there's some awareness of Iko Narasaki in the West. He said that becoming one with each thing we encounter and dealing with it with the whole body and mind is the same as Jiju Yuzamai. Now, Jiju Yuzamai, you might know that term, sort of self-fulfilling samadhi. And so he goes on to say, the forms and protocols show us how to carry out fully Jiju Yuzamai with our body and mind throughout all the activities of monastic life, including zazen and kimhin, as well as washing the face, using the toilet, putting on robes, eating meals, doing prostrations, reciting sutras, sleeping, waking up, and so on. So in other words, everything throughout the day. Now, if you've ever been in a Japanese training temple, you know there is a way to do everything. There is like nothing random. Nothing is left to chance. There is a form for everything. So when he's actually listing using the toilet, washing the face, he's not kidding. There's a way you do stuff, right? So he goes on to say that embodying this is the correct transmission of the Dharma. So somehow embodying this non-separation, this Jiju Yuzamai, through all the activities of your practice day is itself the correct transmission of the Dharma. And he says that is really hard. He says that is really difficult to embody this awakening, this non-separation, this jujuyuzaman. To do that every waking moment, and he would argue every sleeping moment as well, is really not easy. And in order to do that, we need the forms. We need the protocols. We need all of those regulations and all of those things. It makes the forms and protocols really important. So we could say that this is the sort of physical manifestation of this gate statement, this mindfulness that is the wisdom that accords with all dharmas. We could say that that's what forms are doing in our practice. It is a physical manifestation of mindfulness that is the wisdom that accords with all dharmas. So, of course, he's talking about life in a training temple. We're all householders. None of us at this moment is training in the training temple, so we could think that this is not relevant. However, of course, we have forms we use in our practice, even if we're practicing at home. There are rituals in our daily lives that we have, if we're not in the training temple. So if we see Namarupa clearly, we see both form and emptiness, right? So we see the process that we human beings engage in to create our views and to decide, what actions to take based on those views. If we see all that clearly and we see non-separation, then our deportment, our behavior with others, our relationship with the objects that we encounter naturally embodies things like gratitude and sincerity and harmony. Those things will arise naturally if we see clearly how the universe works and what this human condition is like and what it's about. And then, of course, we act skillfully to benefit ourselves and others. So if you're in a training temple or in a practice community and you clearly see the human condition, according to this teaching, naturally what arises for you is gratitude, sincerity, harmony, skillful living in a community, and one way that gets embodied is in forms and protocols and rituals and those kinds of things. So in a training temple, which is where these forms mostly originate, that we've inherited, where we sort of internalize them because we are in the midst of them 24/7, they become sort of part of the body. Those forms are a practical way to organize people, as well as a way to deepen our practice. So if you're feeding 1,200 monks a meal, in a temple, you better have some systems or some protocols, or there's going to be chaos. Right? I mean, imagine cooking meals, and feeding 1,200 people. And if you're in a major training temple, you can have that many people at a time. So there better be some forms about how that happens. It's how we take care of each other. It's how we take care of, the food and the monks and the process and the practice of eating, right? You may know in this tradition, we have, there are formal meals. We can do formal meals with chanting and offerings and all kinds of things. Partly that's a way to deepen practice, and partly that's just a way to practically, get food into people. So these things are not like woo-woo wacky magic, it's also just how do we function? How do we interact with our bowls and our food in a way which is about practice and also is just about how do we take care of the world of form? So knowing and agreeing on something as simple as, who goes through the door first, or who stands closest to the altar during the service, is a way to keep order. We know. I have said sometimes, if I go into a room of, clergy and I look around, I can tell, based on what color people are wearing, who's higher rank than me, who's lower rank than me. I mean, I can tell without asking anybody, without even speaking the language. There's some form about this, which helps us just keep some order. I know who I'm responsible for and I know who I'm responsible to. Something as simple as that. Sometimes we think, well, that feels restrictive, but actually, when we think about it, it's a way to practice mindfulness. I can look around and make a good choice based on simply paying attention. So it's also an opportunity to watch, I think, how our attachment to self arises. If I come in for service and there's somebody who outranks me and stands closer to the altar than me, I might look at that person and go, how come that person outranked? How come that person is standing closer to the altar to me when I just, the other day saw that person sneaking food from the kitchen or something? I mean, we can really watch stuff happening here, right? You know, the attachment to ego, the attachment to stuff. It's a real opportunity to look carefully at our relationships with the things that we perceive, and what stories we write from that. So, of course, in the West, we might not use all the forms that we've inherited from Japan, or we might have to adapt some things, either just to make them practical here or to make them understandable in this culture. We have to do that. You know, we know Buddhism has changed. There has been plenty of syncretism over the course of time and space as it's traveled around the world. You know, nothing stays the same. But practicing in accord with real dharmas, as carrying out forms and protocols of your community, whatever that community is in this moment, is a useful perspective on this gate statement, because your community might be the Sangha, but it might be your family, your workplace, your sports team, your culture, whatever group you identify with. There are forms and protocols, right? There are shared understandings, there are customs, there are, you know, that are ways to take care of each other, to manage whatever your work is together, whatever your activity is together, and to deepen practice, right? To completely manifest awakening and, you know, wisdom and prajna. So, and I've mentioned previously that Dogen wrote a fascicle of the Shobogenzo on these 37 factors of Bodhi that we're thinking about looking at, which includes the 7 branches of balanced truth, which I think, yeah, so in the translation of this that I'm using, it's limbs of truth rather than branches of balanced truth. It's limbs of truth, but okay, same thing. It's not so common, has not been so common for Mahayana teachers like Dogen to talk about these 37 factors of Bodhi, because they are more often associated with early practice, early Theravadan practice. So when you look around for guidance about these 37 factors as like part of this 108 gates of Dharma illumination, Mahayana teachers don't have a lot to say about these 37 factors of Bodhi. But Dogen always said, there is only one Buddha's teaching. It might look different depending on time and culture and where you are, just like we adapt forms and protocols, you know, based on time and culture and where we are. So he brings Buddha's teachings together by considering everything through the lens of Zazen, or everything through the lens of awakening. So Dogen says, yeah, there's, you know, all of these teachings, various times and places, and things that are, you know, early and maybe feel a little bit different than what we do now. But in, you know, the scheme of things, we look at, he says there's only one Buddha's teaching, and the way we bring it together is look at it through the lens of Zazen, or through the lens of awakening. So that's what he does in this fascicle about the 37 factors of Bodhi, and probably why he thinks it's okay to talk about this. Because he says, yeah, it comes from early teaching, but, you know, if we look at it through the lens of Zazen, there's something there for us that we can learn. So he says about this gate statement, mindfulness as a limb of truth is outdoor pillars walking in the sky. Thus it is the mouth being like an acorn and the eyes being like eyebrows, and at the same time it is to burn sandalwood in a sandalwood forest, and it is the roar of a lion in a lion's den. Okay, so I'll tell you what I think he's getting at here, and then if you have another idea, you can share that with everybody at the end. We'll see what we think about this. So I think he's using several images to point to the same thing. I think he's pointing to Namarupa as Namarupa, Namarupa as emptiness, and going beyond that distinction. And we know this is a pattern for Dogen in his teaching. This is something he does a lot. He'll say there's something, and then there's something else, and then there's going beyond the distinction between those two things. So I think he's talking about Namarupa as Namarupa, Namarupa as emptiness, and then how do we even drop that distinction? So outdoor pillars walking in the sky. So in the training temple, or in the, I guess also probably in the community temple, there are indoor pillars and outdoor pillars. So of course these are buildings, traditional buildings, you know, built on very old plans. And there are indoor pillars and outdoor pillars. There are indoor pillars, for instance, in the Dharma hall, which is where liturgy happens. Dharma hall is, Hatto is a big open space with a couple of rows, like next to the altar, of several very large pillars. These are very large pillars. Couple rows of pillars. There are also outdoor pillars that are holding up the front gate, for instance. If it's a big enough temple complex, there's more than one gate, so pillars are out there, holding up things like gates. Outdoor pillars are walking or carrying out their function in their Dharma position, sort of out in the fresh air, right? There's no real boundary between what we call sky and what we call, air closer to the ground. So like it's all sky, if you want to think about it that way. Outdoor pillars are already immersed in sky. We can make a distinction between the pillar and the sky. This thing is hard, this is a pillar, this is air. We can also say that they're not separate because this pillar is already immersed in sky. So sky can also be a symbol of emptiness, which we'll talk about again in a minute. We'll get back to that in a minute. So we have an outdoor pillar walking in the sky. Outdoor pillar is completely manifesting its Dharma function, its Dharma position in the midst of sky. Separate and not separate. The mouth being like an acorn and the eyes being like eyebrows. So I think he's showing us two things that we would say are not the same. We usually don't think that the mouth is like an acorn. We usually don't think that eyes are like eyebrows. We wouldn't mistake those two forms or names for each other. Those things we would say are not the same. So we give these things different names. We think they have different forms, different characteristics, different functions. They behave differently, if you will. They have different Dharma positions. And at the same time, it is to burn sandalwood in a sandalwood forest, and it is the roar of a lion in the lion's den. So now I think he's showing us two things that are the same. So we have sandalwood in the midst of sandalwood, all right? We have something immersed in itself, complete non-separation. And we have a lion roaring in the midst of its own den. So you may know that the lion's roar is usually a symbol of Buddha's teaching. That's a phrase that we encounter, right? So we have lion's roar as Dharma, or lion's roar as what Buddha is teaching. So we have thusness in the midst of thusness, if you will. The lion roaring in the midst of its own den. We have thusness in the midst of thusness, or Dharma is preaching the Dharma, if you want to think about it that way. The functioning of the universe is a complete manifestation of Buddha nature. So there is truly complete interpenetration. There is no way to pull things apart. So we have a bunch of things that appear to be distinct. Mouth and acorn, eyes and eyebrows. And they do in fact each have a particular form and a particular function. That's absolutely real. Namarupa as Namarupa. It's absolutely real. We also have a bunch of things that are completely interpenetrated. We have burning sandalwood in a sandalwood forest, and we have lion roaring in its den. So we have Namarupa as non-separate. Namarupa as empty. Then we have the outdoor pillar walking in the sky. So there's a distinct form that we call an outdoor pillar. We use it in a particular way. So the pillar holding up the front gate is not the pillar inside the hatto. It's walking in the sky, or it's functioning in the midst of emptiness. So this form is not separate from emptiness, and it goes beyond the distinction between form and emptiness. So this is a recurring theme in Dogen's teachings, this form emptiness dropping the distinction. So we can't stop at just form, or just emptiness, or just form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So we can see form as form, that's good. We can see emptiness as emptiness, that's fine. Then when we take the next step, we say, oh, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And then we think, well, now we're done. And Dogen is encouraging us even to let go of characterizing something as form and something as emptiness, or even as some interpenetrated entity, because we're still labeling. As soon as I say this thing is emptiness, there's something which is not emptiness, and yet we know that's not possible, right? So even to say, oh, these things are completely interpenetrated, form and emptiness are completely interpenetrated, is already not necessary, because they are what they are. That's already me creating a thought about form and emptiness and creating separation, right? So we get to keep dropping. We get to keep peeling that onion, right? We get to dropping our separation. We create separation even when we're talking about non-separation. We have to, because, limited human form. But Dogen's encouraging us even to go beyond that. So mindfulness, remembering to practice what Buddha taught, remembering to see the way Buddha sees, is the wisdom that lets us understand what we encounter for whatever it really is. So even though we have compassion for ourselves as deluded human beings, even though we know, we're going to create Namarupa because that's what we do. So we need to not beat ourselves up for that. Even in the midst of that, we don't get fooled by the stuff our minds create out of the experience that comes in through our senses, out of the information that comes in through the sense gates. So the wisdom that allows us to be in the world, doing our bodhisattva work, still being free from Namarupa, is what this gate is about. So what would you like to say about any of that? Maybe you have some fresh insights into outdoor pillars walking in the sky, or anything about Namarupa, form and emptiness, and all that stuff. What's on your minds today? And you can put your hand up, but if I don't see you, just unmute so we make sure we can hear you. What would you all like to say today? Nobody has any insights this morning or questions?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep, absolutely.
So at one point you were talking about something, and I can't repeat this verbatim, unfortunately, where you mentioned like trying to uh, not sort of like become attached to or defined by karma. If I remember correctly, what exactly does that mean? I've heard this term several times, but I don't really understand it too much, or not being defined by karma, etc.
Okay, I'm not sure I put it that way, so I'm going to make a guess about where I was going with that, because I don't, so I wouldn't have said being attached to karma, but there, when we have some encounter with an object and we write a story and create something about that, we're creating karma because we are going to take action based on whatever our conclusion is about that thing. So if I, encounter something and I write a story, gee, I like this a lot, it's my precious thing. I'm going to do some things to defend it, or to make sure you don't steal it from me or something, right? So I'm creating karma based on that. So the bodhisattva takes a different approach. So if we're just sort of regular deluded human beings, we're driven by karma because we're driven by desire, greed, anger, ignorance. This is my precious thing. I'm creating separation. I'm attached to this thing. But the bodhisattva approaches it differently. The bodhisattva is driven by vow. So this is why we say there's a difference between living by karma and living by vow, right? So the bodhisattva is driven by vow. Bodhisattva says, beings are numberless, I vow to free them, and all the other bodhisattva vows. So the motivation for taking action in the world is to liberate beings from suffering, as opposed to perhaps my motivation as a limited human being is I need to create self by owning this thing, or having a relationship with this thing which somehow helps to define small self. So there's a difference between action that's driven by greed, anger, ignorance, desire, which is where I was talking earlier about, what do I want out of that relationship with that object? When I'm creating Namarupa, what am I getting out of it? As opposed to if I'm a pristine bodhisattva, I'm not. My relationship with things of the world is not like that. It's not about what do I get out of it. It's how can I use my karmic circumstances? Because again, bodhisattva has form. Bodhisattva has not gone to nirvana forever and ever, amen. Bodhisattva has a form. So as a bodhisattva, how do I use my karmic circumstances to liberate beings? So when that's us as human practitioners, it might be, how do I use the skills that I have to help other people? If I'm particularly good at cooking or curing illness or building a temple or something, how do I use my skills, abilities, experiences to help other beings? Or if I happen to have particular resources, how do I use that to help liberate beings, right? So how do we encounter the objects that we encounter as bodhisattvas, not be driven by our attachment to them, not be driven by sort of the need to shore up this karmic self, but instead to say, how do I do that for the benefit of all beings? Which doesn't leave out this one, Remember, being martyr is about ego. It's about, oh, I have some idea about who I'm supposed to be, and if and am I not a good person for denying myself? That's not what we're talking about here, right? So turning that around and saying, how do I liberate beings, doesn't leave this one out. So there is still karmic. There are still karmic conditions. We don't deny those karmic conditions, but how do we use them in a way which is not attached, so that awakening is manifested, things flow freely, nothing is obstructed, we don't get stuck, but we're also not creating unwholesome karma out of that, because it's not about desire, greed, anger, ignorance, delusion, right? Have I gone anywhere near where you were headed, Genesis?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, good guess on my part. Very good. Okay, what else would others like to say? Other questions, comments, reflections, things to offer today? Jigen, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make a comment. I don't really have a question, but something that I really love about Dogen that I think you really brought out today really nicely is this, he just has this never ending like bag of tricks of imagery, to keep the teachings like flowing, I guess is the word, because it's like this, eyebrows and eyes, but then sandalwood in a sandalwood forest. And it just never, it doesn't stop. And I think that motion is just such a beautiful part of Dogen's teaching. So I just wanted to say, I thought you really brought it out really nicely today by kind of going through, the columns in the sky and the sandalwood and that. And so it was really very bright and clear.
Good. Well, I'm glad that was meaningful. And of course, Dogen gets all the credit, right? Because those are all his images. I think it's really, we can approach Dogen because he's so difficult to read. And we're reading him in translation, and we're reading him 800 years later in a culture which is very different. And we can approach Dogen and go, oh, just, man, this stuff is so abstract. And yet I think because he keeps using these very concrete images, everyone's got eyes and eyebrows and a mouth, and everyone knows what an acorn is, right? It's like he keeps using these concrete images because I think he's saying to us, look, your practice is right in front of you. Look, awakening is like here. It's not somewhere else. He could have said teacup. He could have said anything. So what's interesting for us, and I think part of the reason sometimes that it feels fresh, is that he is using the things he sees every day around him, right? So for us, it feels a little bit exotic and a little bit poetic. I mean, outdoor pillars, it's like we don't encounter temple gates and hot dough with pillars. And I mean, like for us, that feels a little bit, oh, that's kind of interesting, right? If he was writing today, he would be talking about sneakers and cell phones and microwave ovens, right? Because he's just using the stuff that's around him. So, frequently he uses fences, trees, fences, tiles, pebbles, and walls. He'll say, fences, tiles, pebbles, and walls are preaching the Dharma. Why? Because that's what he was seeing around him. We could be saying traffic lights and sidewalks and bus stops, and right? So I think he's being really smart about trying to bring what feels like teachings that are kind of not concrete, down to it's, here's a clock, it's right here. And yet, because he's using the things around him, we get a different feeling. I've sometimes when I talk about Dogen, I will say things like, if he'd been writing this now, he'd be talking about, the things that we see. So anyway, I'm glad that's meaningful. And I think when we look at the images that he uses, we have to be careful as Westerners in the 21st century not to read too much poetry in there, because he's not being metaphorical. He's saying, here's an object. I'm talking about this object, and I'm talking about this object as an object, and I'm talking about the emptiness of this object, and I'm talking about neither one and both, because he's really into Nagarjuna, right, in the Tetralama. So, he's just being really concrete. So I think as Westerners, we want to get a little bit precious. And Jigen, I'm not saying you're doing that, but just, we want to get a little bit precious because, oh, it's Dogen, Let's consider what his life was like 800 years ago in Japan and what he was seeing. He's not using nature images because somehow he's being metaphorical and leaving society. He's, that's what he saw every day. So I think we just have to remember he's really trying to get us to look at what's in front of us. This is not something out there. This is not something we're going to acquire at some later time. This is right here. It's like eyes, nose. It's right here. So anyway, it's interesting to me what he says about each of these gate statements, because he throws a whole new perspective, I think, on all of them. What would others like to say? and unless Jigen, you had a follow up there, but I think you were done. Okay. All right. What would Hoshin, please?
I just want to comment on what you just talked about. What was brought up here was the nonverbal element of awakening, because we spend so much time reading Dogen. It's all words.
Yep.
We talk to each other. We encounter each other, and we think that's Dharma.
Yep.
And here's Dogen just offering, look at this. It's already teaching you, shut your mind up and pay attention. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. It's just so easy to make it exotic.
Yeah.
And there are good reasons for that. I mean, I think, we have to recognize he does use very poetic language, and he's, not always writing in what would even be sort of modern understandable Japanese for Japanese. And all of those things are absolutely in there. But when we really get down to what he's talking about, or we listen to Hojo-san take apart Dogen, yeah, there's a lot of intellectual stuff there. But what's really the core of that is, look here, look here. Don't go somewhere else. It's about what's in front of you right now. It's about, pens and pencils and chalkboards and stuff. So, it says to me something about why Zazen and Dharma study are completely interpenetrated, and why you don't just do one without the other. It's like, we need the Zazen to understand the Dharma study piece, but it's so easy to think that the Dharma study is here and the Zazen supports the Dharma study, and it's actually, at least in the world of Sanshin, it's the other way. We need to study the Dharma in order to really deeply understand that Zazen is good for nothing. Right? Otherwise, we get attached to Zazen, and we have a lot of ideas about it and who we are because we're sitting and all that stuff. Because again, it's like, what's my relationship with Zazen? Zazen can be Namarupa just like anything else. So what's my understanding of my relationship with Zazen? And can I really deeply see that Zazen is doing Zazen, and then there is no me that's in relationship with this activity? We really need to do the Dharma study in order to understand Zazen. That's the thing. Right? So it's not that we're sitting Zazen in order to somehow become calm enough to see what Dogen saw. Right? Dogen is pointing to our Zazen and going, it's right there. So these things are really, deeply interpenetrated. And when you come to the third leg of what Sanshin is about, which is beneficial action, of course, that's the skillful activity that comes out of that intersection. Right? If we're sitting and dropping off body and mind and really getting to that place of wisdom that accords with all dharmas, and we're also studying the dharma so we understand something about the nature of Zazen, then what comes out of that? Beneficial action, right? This is, the activity as bodhisattvas that liberates beings from suffering without being stuck in three poisonous minds and all that stuff. So these three things are really not separate. We can look at each one, distinctly so that we can study it, but of course they all rise together. All right, that's too much from me. What would you like to say? Don't get me started. Anything else from anybody this morning? Okay. So, I talked a little bit short today because we are also doing our World Peace ceremony following our announcements. So let's go ahead, and unless somebody has something else today, I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin, and we can do closing chant and announcements. Maybe you want to do announcements while I set up for World Peace ceremony.
Yes.
And then we'll do that. So if you need a copy of the Heart Sutra, this is a good time to try to find your copy. That's what we'll be doing for our World Peace ceremony today. Okay? Very good. Thank you for your practice and discussion this morning, and we'll pitch over to Hoshin.